It's been a real pleasure for me to be here since this past Tuesday in British Columbia. This is my first time in this region of the world. The last 2 years I've been living in New York City, and so the closest I come to wildlife or nature is to walk in Central Park. But now I'm surrounded by mountains and glaciers and wildlife, and I've just been enjoying it very much, and also the great hospitality of my Dominican sisters at Queen of Peace Monastery in Squamish. And what they're doing there in building the new monastery is really something to see. And I'm sure that it will be a Mecca, it will be an oasis for many, many people looking for peace and quiet, for a place of solitude and rest. I think they hope and pray that they will be dedicating the new monastery by next summer. So I'm confident that it will be that kind of very, very, very special place for especially Dominicans, Dominican laity, for Catholics in the region, but people of all faiths and backgrounds to come and just drink of the water of contemplation and prayer. When Dr. Paul Ungar called me a number of weeks ago, inviting me to speak at the Catholic Forum in Vancouver, he asked me on the telephone what might be the topic of my talk. And I blurted out, "Was Jesus political?" It is rather catchy, rather provocative sounding. Was Jesus political? How do we answer such a question? Can we answer such a question? Besides the issue of what we mean by the word political, there are a number of problems that we have to contend with when we apply this term political to Jesus of Nazareth. First of all, we in this modern day and age are accustomed, sometimes radically, to separate religion from politics, especially if we understand the term politics as the art and science of the use of power and influence, or if we understand the term political as being partisan. I'm a Democrat, which is true. You're a Republican, which probably isn't true, since I suspect all of you are Canadians, so you're either liberals or conservatives, or NDP. We moderns tend to put the religious and the political into very separate categories, just as institutionally we separate church and state. But at the time of Jesus, in the ancient world, this would not have been the case. What we would consider religious structures and practices were unavoidably enmeshed in political structures and practices, meaning positions and figures with some kind of authority or power over their society. As a matter of fact, there really wasn't even a separate category that we call religion, because the religious and the idea of the sacred permeated all aspects of life. The rulers, the military, commerce, agriculture, family life, birth, marriage, death, all were permeated with the religious. But we moderns, and certainly we in the West, strenuously work to keep religion in its own sphere, usually the private sphere, and to keep politics in another sphere. We usually consider it very illiberal, as we would say, when civil law is predicated on religious law, as in some Islamic countries, or that there should be a Jewish state in the country of Israel. We're uncomfortable with that kind of notion. I think this modern approach influences very much the picture that most people have of Jesus of Nazareth. And this is one of the problems we have to contend with in posing this question: was Jesus political? Most people would respond, well, of course not. Jesus was a religious figure, not a political power player. Jesus, as a purely religious figure, was, as we would say, non-political or apolitical. But I would argue that these modern categories of religion and politics are very artificial, very culture-specific, and they do not do justice to the complex social context or even to the sacred Jewish tradition that inspired the ministry and activity of Jesus in Galilee. It is impossible to separate a religious dimension from political and economic life in traditional societies like the Palestine of the time of Jesus. I think there's also the problem of what we might call our modern Western individualism. We think of Jesus as an isolated individual figure, independent of the social relations in which he found himself. Our individualism contributes to our reducing Jesus to a purely religious figure who is my personal Lord and Savior. Then the original Jesus is reduced to some kind of figure or teacher who uttered isolated sayings and parables relevant only to individuals rather than to entire societies. Another problem has to do with Jesus himself. Can we get back to the original Jesus of Nazareth? What I would call the actual Jesus of Nazareth. Our major sources, the canonical Christian Gospels, were written several generations after the time of Jesus in a very different political economic context, in a very different religious context. Since I believe that all the four canonical Gospels, at least in their final form, post-date the year 70 of the Common Era, the year when the Roman army destroyed the city of Jerusalem and leveled the Jerusalem temple to the ground. This definitively marked the end of Second Temple Judaism, which was the religious context for the ministry of Jesus. And it marked the beginnings of what we call today rabbinical Judaism. At the same time, Christianity would soon separate itself off from rabbinical synagogue Judaism as a distinct religion. Perhaps it's better to say that Christ-believing Jews were expelled from the synagogues, and increasingly the membership of the early Christian churches was predominantly non-Jewish, that is to say, Gentile. Already we have in the canonical Christian Gospels an interpretation of Jesus of Nazareth, to a great extent making him into an exclusively religious figure, downplaying any elements that would alienate the culture of the Roman Empire. I think we see this tendency especially in the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. Even so, I think we can argue that there are profound social and political dimensions of the Christian ethic that we find in these Gospels, which still have social and political implications for today. I think we can know more about the actual, original Jesus of Nazareth the more we know something about the social and cultural context in which he lived. Thanks to historical, archaeological, and sociological studies, we now know a great deal more about the social, economic, and political situation of the two major regions of Palestine at the time of Jesus: Galilee in the north and Judea in the south, including the city of Jerusalem. By the time of Jesus, for almost a century, this region had been part of the Roman Empire, occupied by the Roman military and governed by client rulers set up by Rome. For 40 years, the region had been unified under the kingship of Herod the Great, the Herod of the Christmas stories, who was set up in his rule by Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Herod the Great, King Herod, was quite successful and sometimes brutal in maintaining law and order, establishing massive military fortresses, ruling with an iron fist, allowing no dissent. He was faithful in collecting the tribute money demanded by Rome. It was King Herod the Great who inaugurated many public works projects, as we would say, including the building of several major cities and the renovation of the Jerusalem temple into a marvel of Greco-Roman architecture. The temple and its high priesthood became part of the repressive apparatus of the rule of King Herod the Great. They were not purely religious institutions, but became extremely politicized. When King Herod the Great died, the kingdom was divided by the Romans among the sons of Herod. Herod Antipas received the northern region of Galilee and the region around the Jordan River called Perea. He was a successful ruler, maintaining direct rule over the Galileans with his own court and his own army. He was well liked by the emperors Augustus and Tiberius, but was removed from power in the late 30s by the Emperor Caligula. Herod Antipas was the one who had John the Baptizer beheaded because he feared that John the Baptizer would lead an uprising of the people. At least this is the account given by the Jewish historian Josephus. In that sense, John the Baptizer was at least perceived as a political threat. And in those days, that was enough to get you judicially executed. The Gospels seem to reflect a similar suspicion on the part of Herod Antipas regarding Jesus of Nazareth, At least he kept a close watch on Jesus and his movement. The fear was always that if the local ruler could not maintain law and order, then the Roman army would intervene in order to do so, which was to be avoided at all costs. The southern region of Judea, including the city of Jerusalem, was given to King Herod the Great's son, Archelaus. But he turned out to be an incompetent administrator. There were numerous rebellions and uprisings very shortly after he took power. Typically, the Roman army intervened to put down the rebellions. The Romans then deposed Archelaus, and they set up the high priestly aristocracy as their client rulers in Jerusalem. But with a Roman governor in residence nearby in Caesarea, just to make sure. At the time of Jesus, that would have been Pontius Pilate, a protege of Sejanus, the powerful aide to the Emperor Tiberius. A Roman legion was garrisoned nearby, often entering into the city of Jerusalem during the major festivals, especially during Passover, when uprisings from below were much more likely. Again, we have here the unavoidable enmeshing of the religious and the political in Jewish society. In Jerusalem, especially, the temple and the high priesthood were political. It was the seat of power and the center of tribute gathering and taxation. So we have in Palestine, at the time of Jesus, a political situation of alien rule or occupation by the Romans in collaboration with their local client rulers, the Herodian dynasty in Galilee and the high priestly aristocracy in Judea and Jerusalem. Just to round out this picture a little bit, I just want to say something about the economic and social situation at the time of Jesus. 90% of the population consisted of what we might call rural peasants, who were dominated, very often oppressed economically, by a minority of an urban elite. Their situation was aggravated even further by the clientage system in the Roman Empire, in which more and more people were dispossessed of their ancestral land, which then became part of these vast estates of a wealthy few. So there was an extreme gulf at the time of Jesus between rich and poor in Palestine as in the rest of the Roman Empire.